Hi, thanks for tuning in, for coming to my channel. I hope whatever screenshot I get to upload is a half decent photo of myself because for some reason I tend to capture the thumbnail pics never tend to be particularly flattering. Um, and I hope that doesn't add the optics or anything like that. But I want to talk about the most controversial issue of our times, in my opinion, which is race and racism and issues around that. I admit I was partly prompted to make this video by a comment I came across in my, I forget the video now, but it was one of my recent videos. And the person, whether they're a subscriber or someone who just came across my channel, I don't know, but he accused me of only ever talking about race, and he got into the whole narrative about you're a white guy, what do you know? Black Lives Matter came about because of this. So very much in that sort of guilt narrative, as in putting guilt onto onto me. Um, there's a lot of talking points around the subject, and I'll try to condense this as much as possible. But there are important things to raise. First of all, that charge against me. Do I talk a lot about race? What I talk about in my videos are things that are topical, things I feel that need to be discussed. I try to, I don't sort of have a situation where I think, well, I've made 20% videos on that subject and another 20% on that subject. If there is a dominance of a particular subject, it's only because, yes, partly it's on my mind, but also because it's a topical issue. Now, people might say, oh, don't care about what some critic is saying on your channel, Nathan, but it's not just about that guy, it's about actually more pertinent issues than that. It goes beyond that. And I want to talk about this because I think it is such a fragile subject. I mean, it's so sensitive, and it's well beyond the correctness of the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. It's something else. I mean, it's like walking on eggshells when it comes to race because, as we've seen this year in particular, it's such a dynamic issue, both sides of the Atlantic. I'd still say race in America is a little bit more of a flashpoint area, a little bit more than the UK, but we're certainly not immune from that fragility around race relations. Incidentally, I've just read a report that the actor Earl Cameron has passed away. He was actually Britain's first black star. Um, and he played the role of Bond Contact in Thunderball. He also played the role of the painter in the film The Queen with Helen Mirren. He was 102 years old, so that's not really connected to the video, but just thought to say in passing. Sort of our Sidney Poitier in a sense, in the sense that he was a pioneer. Um, 2020 will be remembered unquestionably as the year of coronavirus, but second to that, the thing that will this year will be remembered for is race. Um, and I think that probably the China West tensions are a big subject of 2020, but and even that race comes into that because there's a lot of conflation between criticism of the Chinese regime, which is legitimate, and perceptions of xenophobia, particularly in the United States. And I think Joe Biden sometimes tapped into that idea that if the right criticizes China, it's somehow motivated by jingoism. It may be sometimes, but that doesn't mean that there isn't legitimate criticism to be made. Um, and I think it's extremely important the two are not conflated. Otherwise, we get into a situation a bit like the whole Islamophobia line, which is if you criticize Islamic extremism, and you get, propaganda outlets like Five Pillars, which are basically just the polite face of Islamism, who try to conflate all criticism of Islam or dislike of Islam for that matter with hatred of Muslims, which is ridiculous. Um, Incidentally, and I don't want to stray off too far off subject, but apparently Majid Nawaz has apologized. Um, I haven't read the full context of this, but according to Five Pillars, he's apologized for insulting Muslims over the years because he's recently been very moved by the plight of the Uyghur people in China, in Xinjiang. I don't know the full context of that. I'll just say this: if Majid Nawaz has apologized, I'd be very disappointed because I respect Majid Nawaz. I think he's a voice of reason. He has consistently stood up against Islamist ideology. It's well known that in his youth he did flirt with radical Islam. Um, Contrary to some of the claims, he's never actually been convicted in a UK court of terrorism. But by his own admission, he did have some Islamist views in his younger days. He's now a moderate. Um, But I would hope that's not true. I would hope he hasn't made a generic apology because he's moved by what's happening to the Uyghurs. There's simply no comparison between the West and what China is doing. No comparison. Um, but on the subject of racism, and perhaps specifically black-white relations, although this also gets into white and Asian relations, I find that this is a major focus of the culture wars. There's other things as well. There's gender and relations between men and women. By gender, I mean the whole politics around trans issues. That's become extremely volatile as well as a talking point, as we've seen from the backlash against J.K. Rowling. Um, Male female issues, for want of a better term, issues around sex and sexism and gender politics, feminism has obviously been very prominent as well with the Me Too campaign. But I still think as volatile as those things can be, I still think it's race that is most explosive of all. Um, I mean, the whole Me Too thing didn't end up in riots. There was some tensions there in terms of how it was going about, with a lot of men feeling it was looking like collective shaming of all men, a lot of women feeling their voices had been ignored for too long. There was tensions there. But with the race issues, I mean, the video I made, for example, recently, and I think that was the one the guy commented on. I was talking about how difficult it is for the Metropolitan Police, and I'm sure it's the same for other forces in dealing with in doing their job these days when it comes to race. Because if they arrest a black suspect in London, immediately people gather around and accuse them of racism for doing their job. I still think that there is a problem of criminality in the black community, and immediately saying that, that's explosive. People will say that's a racist statement, but it's an undeniable fact. And this is the difficulty with this subject. Stating things that are verifiable. They're not conspiracy theories. They're not just stirring things up. Things that can actually be verified. For example, by the Office of National Statistics and so on, crime data, that sort of thing. Um, if you're white and you point those things out, here's the thing with when it comes to racism. I think it's particularly inflammatory when the charge is against white people. I mean, I'm not saying it's easy for anyone being accused of racism, but I do think that if you are a minority person and you're accused of anti-white racism, the survival of that is much easier than if you're white and accused of racism. And there's an example of this: the different treatment of Professor David Starkey and Professor or Dr. Priyamvada Gopal at Cambridge University. They both made racist statements, but Starkey was fired, denounced, and forced to apologise. Priyamvada Gopal was praised, hailed, and she kept her job. Yet her statements were just as inflammatory, and she never made any apology. Rather, she doubled down, stood by what she said, which was not verbatim, but we need fewer white people. Right now, there's a best-selling book, and I have mentioned it a few times because I think it's relevant, I think it's topical. Why I No Longer Speak to White People About Race. This is a bestseller. Now, whether that's been, I wouldn't hold the publishing industry to be above a little bit of manipulation, i.e., because of the current climate, it may have kind of been given extra publicity, which in a kind of roundabout way has perhaps boosted its sales, who knows? But that's in the front window of Waterstones. Why I No Longer Talk to White People About Race by Renee Edo Lodge. Now, why I find that so problematic is if that is her starting argument, where do you go from that? If you're white, what dialogue can you have with someone who says, I don't want to speak to you because you're white? I think it's profoundly racist, but it's being promoted. It is literally being promoted. And it may be that her message in the book is more moderate, is a little bit more nuanced, but that title, titles of socio-political books are chosen for very specific reasons. And I refuse to believe she would have had no say over the title. So it's provocative, but I guess my issue is not so much that it's a provocative title, it's that there is no way, no way a white writer could write something similarly provocative and get away with it. They certainly wouldn't be hailed. They would have to go to some underground publisher. There's no way they would have the book put in the front window of Waterstones, even if they were coming at it from an anti-racism point of view. So that is what I think a lot of people, and not just white people, incidentally, I think an increasing number of minority people are getting fed up of the likes of Black Lives Matter thinking they speak for them and saying we all think alike, when actually there is a plurality of opinions within the black and ethnic minority communities. I don't even like to say community as a single thing because that in itself indicates everyone thinks the same and they don't, obviously. But one of the biggest problems I think with this subject is the term is so casually thrown around. We see it all the time. I mean, we hear, for example, about microaggressions. We hear about everyday racism. Um, and all the time, there's rhetoric about white dominance in the film industry in X, Y, and Z. And it's not always that it's explicit said this is racist, but the narrative is very clear, which is that white people are the problem. Now, people might say I'm being paranoid, but I think there's something very, very damaging going on here. I think there's an enormous amount of distortion, and I think that when the charge of racism is thrown around, the onus is put on the subject of that charge to prove their innocence, to defend themselves and say they're not racist. There is no weight whatsoever put on those who are throwing the charge. So, if, for example, you get a black actor or an Asian social commentator, you name it, and they make the charge of racism against someone, a large segment of the press will pick that up and promote it. And the way much of the press handles racism, I think, is a damn disgrace. Actually, it infuriates me because I think it is incredibly reckless and irresponsible. They're in a position of power. Now, to me, that's an abuse of power. I'll give an example of this. The Metro newspaper, about 2 years ago, there was a piece where they said a man hurls racist abuse at Polish passenger on train. When you look at the video, it's far, far less dramatic than they make it out to be. What actually happened was the Polish guy was drinking, which is against the rules, and a British guy asked him not to. That was about the height of it. And it was a bit tense. They had a bit of an argument, and that was about it. So I do believe a large segment of the media, I won't say everyone, but a large segment of the media thrives on racial tensions. They will deny it, but I honestly believe it's good for them. They know it sells. And I think that is cynical and reprehensible. Now, to clarify this, I'm not saying that there's no racism out there. I'm not saying there aren't legitimate issues to report and discuss and debate. But I do think it needs to be done professionally, and especially tabloid-esque newspapers, they will report racism, alleged racism as fact more often than not. That's incredibly damaging. Now, yes, people can sue for libel, but it's reckless. It's just fueling the flames. And we're in this situation where, because of movements like Black Lives Matter, they're demanding that these issues are raised, right? But if we're going to talk about these things, let's talk about them candidly. That means that white people shouldn't have to feel that every single word they say might be interpreted as racist if it's in a differing position from a black person. So, for example, if I say there is a serious problem in London with young black men being involved in knife gangs, that's a statement of fact. But because I'm white, there will be people out there who say, it's dog whistle politics. I think it was Douglas Murray who said the thing about dog whistle politics is those who allege that hear the whistle. In other words, they are the ones actually influencing that dynamic of racism, where it might not exist. I'm not in denial here that there are real problems with racism out there. I've seen white yobs. I've personally seen it, coming out with disgusting language. For example, there was footage of a woman in Glasgow recently who was hurling abuse at a takeaway owner. Totally disgusting, vulgar language, racist language. Um, and that you could tell the guy was calling the police. She was just making a nuisance of herself. She was drunk, and she kind of pulled on the glass barrier of the takeaway place, and it crashed down. I've no doubt there are a lot of yobs out there who really do behave like that. I've personally seen it. So I would never say there isn't a problem with white racists. I would never claim that there isn't that problem in our society. But what I find very disturbing is when it comes to race, we can't even have a civilized debate without that charge of racism being thrown out. So you can't have just a discussion and say, well, look, can we meet halfway? Or can we say this is a problem that needs to be looked at? Instead of A, white people always feeling that they need to walk on eggshells, and B, when people make that charge of racism, there's absolutely no sort of onus on them to prove it. I find that reprehensible. There is a left-right thing going on here because the left are far more guilty of throwing the term racism around. No question about that. But even there's many people on the left know there's a problem with this. I have a pretty left-wing friend. I mean, I'm sure she'd call herself a socialist. She ticks all the boxes of what you would expect someone well on the left to be. She's even being pretty progressive on, and I don't like that term, but it would fit into that narrative of political discourse. She's been very like not pro Black Lives Matter, you broadly sympathetic to them, and she ticked all those boxes. She said that she likes her history, and she would think it's ridiculous tokenism to see black actors put into a film set in Saxon era England because it would blatantly be tokenism. Likewise, I wouldn't expect to see many white cast members in a film set in 1940s Harlem. But those are the sort of things that the most, I don't want to say innocent things, but things that really shouldn't be focused on the culture wars are becoming focused on the culture wars. So, for example, instead of just watching a film and enjoying the subject matter or taking in the subject matter, it becomes about the cast. It becomes about the cast, and that's just absurd. It's very polarizing. But I just think it's sad that you get a lot of white people like myself, who are. I hate all forms of racism. But what is undeniable these days is that anti white racism does, it absolutely does get a free pass. Or at least there will be criticism, but it will come from, people who've heard it and they're not happy and they'll go to the internet and write comments. And sometimes that might get, unpleasant because they feel voiceless. So if you have, for example, an Asian academic who makes an inflammatory comment about all white people, the media won't pick that up for the most part. It's disgraceful how they will just let it pass. Therefore, a lot of white people understandably will feel angry about that. They'll vent online, and some of them will, cross a line. They might threaten the person, and that's stupid because it's wrong. You shouldn't threaten someone for an opinion, no matter how horrible the opinion is. I think that's what's happening. I think a lot of white people feel that because of these double standards, it's kind of fueling the fire. And I'm not saying there's ever an excuse for threats or, I would never advocate, for example, responding to minority people being racist by being racist in return. So, for example, if you are like I was angry about Dr. Gopal's attitude, or if you're angry about Yusra Kagali's attitude, she is a co-founder of the Toronto Black Lives Matter. Um, express that anger. I think it's very important to express that anger, but don't respond by calling her racist slurs. The most stupid way to I mean, responding to racism with further racism is the stupidest way to respond to it because all that will do is, if you're white and you respond to racism with racism, then unfortunately, you're just going to be portrayed as a racist. It won't be framed as, oh well, you were responding to racism in and of itself. And this applies to anything actually. That's why, a lot of these people, when they are exposed, not so much by the media, but by people who are tired of the double standards, when they will say this black person or this Asian person's being racist, often the excuse is, oh, I was only responding to right wing trolls. In fact, that's the excuse Sarah Jong used, the Asian American correspondent for the New York Times. Her excuse for her vitriolic rants against all white people was that she'd apparently been trolled by some right wing Trump supporters. Now, maybe she had. Maybe there had been some pretty unpleasant comments. I don't know. I did see some of the backlash was certainly not the sort of thing I would have done. Very, very ad hominem, and some of it was racist. You don't deal with racism by further racism. Now, personally, I sleep comfortably because I know that when I talk about these issues, I'll always be honest, but I'm also, no one can honestly look at anything I've said and say that's a white supremacist statement, and I would challenge them. So if you've come to my channel and you think this is my position, or you think I've said anything racist, I say prove it. And this is kind of the problem, isn't it? Because there's not enough of an onus for people to prove it. Saying something is racist is just racist is not good enough. I think you need to explain why something is racist. Society, this can apply across society as well. Just because a white officer arrests a black suspect doesn't mean it's motivated by racism. In all likelihood, it means that suspect fits the description of the person they're trying to find. I remember the series Crime Watch UK. It was a great series because, firstly, it did help solve a lot of crimes and catch suspects. But when they were making descriptions of suspects, they were very candid. They said the suspect is 6'5", white, wearing a red top. The suspect is 5'10", black, has a scar on his face, whatever it was. And that information was critical in order to catch the person. Um, so particularly when it comes to crime, you can't just pretend that race is irrelevant when there is um, a situation where communities are more affected. For example, there is a problem in the traveller community, there is a problem in the black community with criminality. That's not to say there isn't white criminals. It's just saying that in particular areas there are particular problems. And it's this hardly politically correct denial of that, which isn't going to help anyone. The left immediately has a knee jerk reaction like, oh, it's all politics. And they simply ignore facts. Ignoring the facts on these things will not help anyone. It won't help black victims of crime. It won't help white victims of crime. It won't help anyone. So if race is going to be a major subject of our national discussion, let's have an honest debate, not just one where pressure groups like Black Lives Matter are pandered to by the media and told what they want to hear. They need to be challenged as well on some of their views, on um, some of their attitudes. And yes, their concerns need to be listened to. But what Black Lives Matter need to understand is they are also making some pretty controversial positions. I mean, one of the co-founders wants a total abolition of prison. One of the American co-founders wants a total abolition of prison, not just fewer inmates. She wants total abolition. That's an extreme position. So Black Lives Matter cannot on one hand say we demand you listen to us, but oh, don't criticize us, don't scrutinize us. No, you can't have it both ways. If you're going to be vocal about something, you need to be prepared to be scrutinized and ask questions in turn. I mean, if I was pushing some sort of idea or movement, I'd expect questions. Um, and there's just so many things that make no sense about what's been going on this year. How the statement "all lives matter" can be can infuriate people and can be controversial in of itself is insane. I mean, the charge is, oh, well, it delegitimizes the concern that Black Lives Matter. And they'll say, oh, but we're not saying all lives don't matter. Okay, but you're also not denouncing the racists in your midst. So when that banner flew over, I believe it was Burnley, saying white lives matter, that's just a natural consequence of constant ethnocentrism being pushed in one direction. Ethnocentrism will be pushed in another direction. And I'm not justifying that. I wouldn't have supported that banner. I mean, white lives do matter, but it's ethnocentric. I'm critical of Black Lives Matter because it is unquestionably an ethnocentric movement, and I think that by nature is divisive. And I'll just close with this observation: there are segments of Black Lives Matter are becoming more, if not violent, certainly militant. They're wearing fatigues like the Black Panthers. And I'm not talking about Americans here. I'm talking about some of the British segments. That's concerning because the Black Lives Matter ended up basically being just criminals, you know, uh, intimidating people and getting involved in extortion and all sorts of things. They pretty much ended up as a gang. Black Lives Matter will not acknowledge black criminality in their midst. You know, when Anthony Joshua made his speech, he said that knife crime's a problem, but why is it that when white people talk about that, they're immediately denounced as racist? I think if Black Lives Matter is making demands that everyone listens to them, listens to their concerns, okay, but they also need to listen to the concerns of other members of society. People who think that there is a serious problem in London with gang culture, and a lot of that involves young black men. Sure, there'll be young white men as well, but it's the majority of stabbings, stabbing victims, and stabbing suspects have been black. It's just a fact. I just think it's sad that politicians and other public figures need to tread so carefully with this, with stating facts. Even a black public figure like Sir Trevor Phillips will find himself in hot water for telling the truth. That is, and if we're not going to have honesty, if we're not going to have a candid discussion about this, I fear that people will be moved to extremes. I fear that people will go to the far right because they'll be pushed there. You know, I think people get radicalized by circumstances. It's never an excuse, but if we do see a rise in the far right, it will be because of the utterly pathetic way the media has handled much of this, and frankly, a large part of the establishment, by blindly pandering to Black Lives Matter instead of actually just engaging in an adult debate and saying, okay, you've got these concerns, we need to listen to those concerns, but you also need to acknowledge this. And I don't think that's been happening. I think a lot of politicians and media people and celebrities have been so determined to virtue signal and to pander to this that they're terrified of being called racist. When Lawrence Fox got a backlash for no other reason than refusing to apologise for being a white guy, um, you had The Guardian claiming that he was being radicalised. And that's insane. If you listen to the man's interviews, he has denounced woke intolerance, but I haven't seen a single thing that Lawrence Fox has said that can honestly be described as white supremacist or far right. And I respect him for sticking his head out. I mean, he could have said after that whole thing, "Oh, I'm very sorry if I offended everyone. I shouldn't have done it. Sorry." But he stuck to his guns. I respect him for that. I respect J.K. Rowling for sticking to her guns because it would be the easiest thing in the world to save your career and say sorry. But then, where's the integrity with that? And Lawrence Fox has now found it difficult to get work. Apparently, he said this. So when it comes to racism, we need honesty. Yes, honesty about the problems of racism. Yes, we need to listen to concerns of social movements, but we also need to have honesty across the board, no matter how offensive it is to people. Otherwise, you're going to find that some white people will be radicalized. They will actually be radicalized and go to the far right when they may have started off as moderates, and that's tragic. So, in my opinion, Black Lives Matter is doing a lot more harm than good, and I know there are many patriotic Black Britons who agree with that.